and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Monday, May the 2nd. Boy, April has just flown by. May 2nd, 2022. How about that? All Tuesday, 22022. I'm glad that we're here together. Trust you guys had a really good night's sleep, waking up feeling refreshed. Last night, I very rarely ever have a problem sleeping, but last night I got up somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning and came downstairs and worked on my my little talk that I'd like to share with you this morning. So I'm ready to go. So I trust that you guys have your Bibles open and ready to dig in. I'm kind of excited about this week's topic because I get to share one of my favorite stories in the scriptures. There is, for us, we have been looking at a new series called Power, experiencing it for yourself. And the whole tenor of this series is really looking at the miracles of Jesus and then asking ourselves the question, what are we to make of these miracles? What are we supposed to learn from the miracles that Jesus has, demonstrated? Because as the writers begin to give us more and more insight into who Jesus is and his ministry, one of the things that we find out is there is not a dearth of material, right? I mean, Jesus did many, many things. In fact, it's interesting. If you go to the end of the Gospel of John, and in it says that if all of the works that Jesus accomplished were written down, it says there is not a library that could hold them. So there isn't like I said, there's no dearth for material, but it has everything to do with how Jesus himself, right? And the Spirit is really trying to give us some insight into how we are to understand something more about Jesus and his mission and ministry, so that it would just draw us in. So the stories themselves are not just highlighting the wonder-working power of Jesus, but they also are meant to do something more. They are to demonstrate, especially in Matthew's gospel, that Jesus is the Messiah that was promised. Because constantly throughout this book, Matthew is trying to lay a very strong foundation on which you and I can build a life of faith upon. So that if we feel, if we experience that Jesus is who he says he is, that he's the one that has come to fulfill all that the Father has, placed before him, then we ought to have a confidence then to listen to what Jesus has to say and begin to put those things into practice. So this week we have looked at a passage that's found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. It's a story of a centurion who has a servant who is not well. And what we discovered as we looked at this passage in Matthew 8:13 is that here was a faith that astonished Jesus. That I mentioned in my sermon on Sunday that very often we could be amazed at Jesus, at his teaching. We can be amazed at not only his teaching, but we can be amazed at his miracles, works of power. But here's a text that says that Jesus is amazed at the faith of this, centurion. Jesus is the one who is now astonished by the faith that is being depicted by this man. And so I think it's worth taking a look at, right? What does a faith that astonished Jesus really look like? And so we examined that this past week. And we made a couple of observations, but I thought for the benefit of perhaps of those who have not yet seen listened to that sermon on Sunday, let me read the text here and just give you a few highlights here. It says, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, he says, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Now, when you read through this text, you see Jesus, right, who is now at the home base of where he's going to begin his ministry. Capernaum was a seacoast town up in the region of Galilee, just below south of Syria, and it was a small coastal village, and comprised mainly of Gentiles, and so from that platform, Jesus begins to reach out and use that to begin to proclaim the good news of the kingdom of heaven. It says that a centurion is there. This was an outpost. A centurion is is a Roman soldier who, by virtue of his title, is in command of about 100 soldiers. He's a Gentile, and it appears that he has a servant who is unable to get out of bed and is in terrible suffering. Now, when you read a text like this, you may not fully grasp what is going on here, and so what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of a hint of what is going on, and that is that in our text you find Jesus and a Gentile. And now in our current society, that may not raise any big issues, but for the Orthodox Jews of that time, they considered the Gentiles to be unclean, that they were to be avoided at all costs. Even to the point where even with tax collectors and sinners, it was even worse for them. They would never think about darkening the home of a Gentile, and so consequently, here in this text, you have a Gentile not only seeking Jesus out, but calling him Lord. Think about it. On multiple levels, the story should just like hit you as if someone is taking their nails and dragging it across a chalkboard. You ever hear that sound, right? It just sends chills up your spine. There is something really strange about this. And the fact that he would call Jesus Lord, think about this. Here is not only as I said, a Gentile, but a Roman soldier. And the Romans are the ones who are now subjugating the people of Israel. So on numerous levels, there are things about the story that immediately just don't seem to fit. So what is it about this centurion that would, prompt him to want to go and see Jesus? Now, obviously, there's a servant that he seems to offer a lot about, but in typical Matthew fashion, he doesn't give you a whole lot of details. Some of the other Gospels, they kind of fill in some of these other details, but Matthew is very clear. He gives you just enough facts so you know the tenor of where this whole scene is moving, because he has a main point that he wants to drive home. And you're going to see for all of these miracles, that main point is going to appear in verse 16, when he would say that this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and he carried our diseases. A reference to the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 53, once again underscoring that Jesus is the Messiah. But let's get back to our story, because if you are hearing what I'm saying and it doesn't, you're really not quite picking up the real angst in the opening line, Jesus goes on and says, I will go and heal him. Now, innocent enough statement, but look how that statement is responded to by the centurion. His response is, Lord, I don't deserve for you to come under my roof. And so immediately you begin to realize that for the centurion, he is not unaware of the social prejudices that exist. He understands that for Jesus to do that would mean that Jesus would put himself in a position that people in his day would have not looked favorably upon. And yet, it did not prevent him from asking, from seeking, from knocking. Does that sound familiar to you? Does that not sound like words that Jesus uttered on the Sermon on the Mount? Again, just making himself, accessible to people and demonstrating his heart's desire to really come alongside and be one who would really help to nurture those around him. So this centurion comes, even though he's recognizing here that this is flying in the face of all kinds of social convention in that moment. So that's one of the things that I just want you to take a note of, that the faith of this centurion is one that is rising above those kinds of social prejudices. And then I just want you, for like a little side note, maybe something just to think about in the course of your day. Jesus asks us to be salt of the earth and light of the world. He said that in this world, we will face, persecution. In fact, remember going back to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus pronounced all the blessings, right? We know that as the Beatitudes. He said, blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men insult you, persecute you, falsely accuse you on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in the kingdom of heaven. So here's a text now that is beginning to underscore the fact that there is going to be tension as we live out these principles of what it means to be part of the kingdom of heaven. But rather than shrink back, God is saying, look at that as a badge of honor. Yeah, what you ought to be doing is making sure that what I am doing from this purity of heart, trying to fix my eyes on Jesus and live his way. But don't be too proud, right? Don't stand as if you're above everyone, because the attitude here, right, is you got to take the log that's in your eye before you could start trying to take the splinter that's in someone else's. You can't do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen of them, because then you've already received your reward. But it says when you give to the needy, or you do any other acts of righteousness, like prayer, right? Any of those things, he says, you need to do it to your Father who is you should do it for him who sees in secret and can reward you. So this idea then is that I am always living my life for an audience of one. And it's going to place me in a position where the tenor of this world is going to try to conform me more and more into its image. And God is asking me to lay hold of his truth and begin to live in an entirely different fashion. Here is a centurion who is beginning to demonstrate a faith that places him beyond the social conventions of his day. So that's the first thing I want you to see. He's rising above that. And consequently, I would just, in a way of applying this passage into our lives today, I would say, are we being more and more conformed to the world around us, or do we find ourselves being transformed by the renewing of our minds? That's always a great challenge. That's something that we should always be striving for. So then notice what else happens here. The centurion in verse 9 says, I myself am a man under authority. And he says, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell this one, come, and he comes. He says, and he says, and I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard this, notice what it says here in verse 10. It says that he was astonished and said to those following him, I tell you the truth. I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Do you hear what he just said? So many times, like I said earlier, we're amazed at the authority, at the teaching, at the power that Jesus displays. In this text, it says that Jesus is astonished by the centurion and the faith that he is demonstrating. And why is this? Because he is beginning to see that Jesus is one who comes with the authority, who is able to do what he says. I'm certain that for this centurion, he doesn't have this fine-tooth faith yet, being able to fill in all the blanks and fill out a orthodox statement of faith yet. But what he is seeing in Jesus is one now whose words and his actions are combined. He sees in Jesus one who has authority. He's speaking to Jesus on a man-to-man kind of level, saying, look, I understand what authority looks like. I live in this world all the time. I know a chain of command. I know what it means to give orders, and I'm sure he knows what it means to take orders. I grew up in a household where the United States Marine Corps was all large letters. I get it. My whole life has been built around that. And so to hear this centurion now begin to look at his experiences in this life, the authority that he has, and then begin to recognize that Jesus, by virtue of what he has been teaching, by virtue of the miracles that he has been performing, it emboldened him not to just go against social convention, but it emboldened him to go and ask Jesus for help. And what it said to me is that here's a faith then that was beginning to see the possible in the impossible. To see the possible in the impossible. Because the fact that his servant is paralyzed, terribly suffering, so much so that there's a desperateness to this, because this centurion is seeking Jesus out. Just says that he probably exhausted all other means, and now he's afraid that he's going to lose this servant whom he cares about. It says something about the centurion's heart, but it also says something about Jesus. And it says something about the centurion's faith. Jesus gets it. That's why he says he was astonished and said, you know what? I haven't seen anyone in Israel with such great faith. It's a put down on Israel, but it definitely is an elevation of the centurion. He's saying that he's beginning to understand who I am and the authority of which I possess. And that placed this one individual in a great, great position. So Jesus goes on then and says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then Jesus looks at this centurion and says, go, it will be done as you believed it would. And it says the servant was healed at that very hour. So this whole story is really to demonstrate again the authority that Jesus brings in the miracles that he has performed as this Son of God, as the Messiah that was promised. That's why in a few verses, we read that reference to the fulfillment of a passage that we find in Isaiah. Matthew is very, very clear to make sure that we are not missing the main point. That is that Jesus is the Son of God that has been promised. He is the Redeemer that has come into the world. Just like it said at his birth, he shall be called Jesus, for he shall forgive his people from their sins. And isn't that really what's being talked about here in verse 11? Verse 11 is referring to this banquet that's going to be in heaven. We're going to get into that a little bit later on in this week. But that's a heavenly banquet. It says when the world is going to be reconciled and at peace once again, when all things are going to be made new, every generation of believers is going to go back, and there seated at that table are going to be people from the east and from the west, and they are going to be there joined by the fathers of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're all going to be sitting there in fellowship. And the implication here is that the centurion is going to be one of them. See, for the Jews of that day, they thought that this feast was reserved only for the Jew. But no. This text here is saying that it is all about all who respond well to this Messiah that God is bringing. It says all of them are going to have a seat at that table, which means the east to the west, everybody, Jew, Gentile, which again, I hope you guys have heard me say this on numerous occasions, but it goes all the way back to the covenant that God made with Abraham that said, through you, Abraham, I am going to bless all the nations of the world. It was never just a Jewish thing. The Messiah, even though he would come through the line of Abraham, and eventually God would take the nation of Israel and use them as a platform on which to speak to the world, it was always about engaging those around them and seeking to let their light shine. That's why he said, he gave them the 10 commandments, because they were going to go into a land where it was filled with all kinds of idolatry. And what was the first commandment? You shall worship the Lord thy God and him alone. Right? You shall have no other gods before me. The second commandment, you shall not make any graven images to bow down to them. Yeah, the third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In other words, don't put words in God's mouth. Let God speak for himself. See, all of this was to give the people a sense that they were different from those around him. Can you understand now why Jesus says to his followers, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world? You're going to be different. And you have to maintain that. That's why you can't allow your salt, you can't lose your saltiness. You can't let that light be hidden. Because if that happens, he says, then we've lost, really, the whole purpose for which he has raised us up as a people. We're to be out there being like a billboard for what it means to be a child of God. One who is, first of all, humbled and recognized that we have been forgiven much. And because of that, we ought to love much. Because that same grace that we are so thankful for, we want to make sure that we are extending to those around us. That's why Jesus says, you got to love your enemies. You got to go that second mile. You got to turn that cheek. You got to take the cloak off your back. Because sometimes that's what it's going to take in order to influence those around us. And you know what? Some of you guys who are listening today, that's exactly what happened to you. You've seen that in other people. You've read that about Jesus, and it touched you at your core, and you're a different person because of it. See, all of this is heading not just for the miracle. All of this is heading to a place where you and I are going to stand in this place known as the kingdom of heaven, where all things are going to be redeemed. And what does it say that's going to happen at this heavenly feast? Well, I'm going to take you to an Old Testament passage, later in the week that will explore that. It's found in Isaiah chapter 25, and it speaks about this heavenly feast. But it was always been for all the nations. All those who have been reconciled to God will have a seat at this table. I thought this whole story was just about healing a centurion's son. No. You see, this story wasn't just about healing the physical body of this servant. It was about seeing in the centurion a faith that gave him a seat at the table. That's what this story is about. And the only way to do that is through Jesus. That's why Jesus is astonished to find such great faith in this Gentile. And what was that Gentile really all about? There's an interesting text that you could read about, and it's found in Ephesians chapter 2. And in Ephesians chapter 2, 11 and 12, it says, this is what Paul writes to the Ephesians, just reminding them again. He says, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, right? They had no claims to the Messiah, because the Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, right? Messiah, anointed one. So it says, remember at that time, you who were Gentiles by birth, you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But Ephesians will go on to say that those who were far away, God drew near. He broke down the middle wall of hostility that existed between Jew and Gentile. And Jesus brought both groups together to form one body. That's what Jesus is always about. He's always about this reconciliation. And so I think that when we look at this text, then you see this extraordinary faith that amazed Jesus was simply a faith that didn't give in to the social conventions and prejudices of his day. It was a faith that saw the possible in the impossible, because he had a big picture of who Jesus is and recognized the authority that Jesus bore. See, if that happens in you and me, what's going to prevent us from running this race of faith? Because it's all about Jesus. It's about his power that now works in us. And isn't that what Jesus said he was going to give us? Do you remember the text where he says that wait in Jerusalem for the gift that my Father will give you? For you will be what? Baptized with the Holy Spirit, with power. The Spirit comes into your life full of power and love and self-discipline. It is the Spirit now, God's Spirit living in us, that enables us to begin to live out this life that Jesus has put before us. So in this next couple of days, I'm going to take you to another passage that's found in the book of Acts. And this text is in Acts chapter 10. And if you want, you could read ahead. You could read Acts 10 and 11. And it's a parallel, at least in theme and in content, to the story that we just read about in Matthew 8:5 with the centurion. Only this time, a centurion is given a name, and his name is Cornelius. It's a great story, much to glean from. So join us tomorrow as we unpack a little bit more about what's going on in this ministry of Jesus as he demonstrates power in the miracles that he performs. My friends, I hope that was a word of encouragement to you, enough that you'd go out and seize the day. And remember, God is good all the time. Love you. Make sure that you share this post with your friends. It's a good way, as we say, to just continue to share the content of the scriptures with people, that their eyes might be open and that they might run with endurance this race of faith. God bless you. Love you guys. Lord willing, we'll spend more time again tomorrow. God bless.